to go and look at the mechanisms involved in reabsorption and secretion. Look at how essential ions, glucose, amino acids are transported. Again, the majority of the transport mechanisms occur within the proximal convoluted tubule. We'll look at the clearance of glucose because it's a model system, how the kidney is able to clear glucose. And that introduces another concept called the transport maximum, the ability to move a particular solute from tubular fluid or from the plasma into presumptive fluid or the other way around. So there are defined maximums that the kidney can work at which have important implications in pathophysiology. We'll look at the reabsorption of bicarbonates, and this brings us back to some of the lung function that I covered with you, that bicarbonate is a valuable buffer within the body, and is one of the key ways that we can balance our pH within the body to either get rid of excess bicarbonate by converting it back to CO2 and increasing our breathing rate to blow off CO2, or we can have a metabolic regulation where the kidney regulates how much bicarbonate is lost into urine. So that's our alternative way of balancing our pH within the body. And we'll touch on it today, and we'll come back to it in the very last lecture of Dr. Conlock. So we'll look at some of those secretory processes that occur in the proximal tubule, and we'll also look at how we can estimate renal plasma flow rates. So this is very similar to the glomerular filtration rate we looked at on Monday. So we're finally moving away from the glomerulus, and we're moving on to the next step of kidney regulation. And in the proximal convoluted tubule, we talk about obligatory reabsorption and secretion. And what we mean by that is that there's no specific regulation of these processes. They are driven by the ionic gradients, they're driven by the activity of the sodium pump, and therefore you don't need separate neural regulation or chemical regulation in the form of different hormones stimulating this reabsorption and secretory processes. Further along in the kidney, we do have regulated reabsorption, particularly in the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts, and we'll look at those hormones next Monday. So within the proximal convoluted tubule, here's a nice blown up view of the epithelial lining the proximal convoluted tubule. And this is where the majority of uptake occurs. So where you're going to save all those valuable nutrients that are sitting in tubular fluid from the ultrafiltrate generated through the glomerulus, and where you want to reabsorb as much as possible and also secrete other elements to remove them as waste products. So there's lots of different secretory mechanisms, there's lots of movement of different solutes and water in this area of the kidney. But within the proximal tubule, the balance of fluids remains isotonic. So although there's a lot of sodium, chloride, potassium, etc. that's being reabsorbed at this point, it's reabsorbed in an isotonic manner. And we'll look at those mechanisms and how they are balanced. When you look at the view of the proximal convoluted tubule, you see there's a lot of microvilli. So that's extending the plasma membrane, increasing the surface area in this part of the tubule, and that facilitates the exchanges between tubular fluid and blood. You'll also see, if you look closely at the structure of these cells, the huge numbers of mitochondria that are present throughout the cell. So these are very energetic cells. They require a lot of ATP, a lot of energy to drive processes. And most of that energy is going to drive the sodium, potassium, ATP, the sodium pump. So we have to modify the ultrafiltrate composition that's been generated. And that's where the function of the proximal convoluted tubules come in. They play a number of important functions. So this is where the reabsorption, or the bulk of the sodium chloride is reabsorbed. And as I said, it's reabsorbed as isotonic sodium chloride solution. It's also where you reabsorb the essential solutes such as glucose and amino acids. And it's one of the points where we can regulate our body fluid pH. And this is regulated in this area, particularly by bicarbonate reabsorption. Hydrogen ions play a role, and I'll show you how the mechanism evolves. And this is where we secrete a number of different organic molecules as well, again, in terms of removing waste products. So the principles of the movement of solutes and water in the proximal convoluted tubule are that we see reabsorption, so that's movement from the tubular fluid, so movement from the ultrafiltrate, so within the nephron structure, across cells into the blood. So moving from the apical surface, that's the surface that has all those microvilli on them, across the cells to the basolateral border, and then into the blood supply. When you look at this in cross-section in histology, here we've got a section, and when you cut through the kidney, you don't just see one nephron in isolation. They're all packed together to generate this large filtration system. So here we've got a whole series of proximal convoluted tubules that have been cut through, and reabsorption moves fluid from inside the tubule across the cell wall into surrounding small capillaries or large capillaries, whereas secretion is the net movement of fluid that has passed through the glomerulus, and only a proportion of that fluid is filtered at any pass through the glomerulus, and the rest exits by the efferent arteriole into the peritubular capillaries. And then the name comes from, they sit around the tubule. Peri means sitting around the tubule. So they are capillaries that are surrounding the tubule to allow exchange of solutes and fluids. So we get secretion from the peritubular capillaries. So this is your main filtration step, but there is still movement in the form of secretion from those capillaries back into tubular fluid to increase the removal of certain ions and other solutes. So when we look at secretion, here we've got a large capillary here, and the movement would be from the capillary back into the proximal convoluted tubule. The movement can also be either transcellular through the cells or paracellular between the cells. So I've got a simplified diagram here, so transcellular moving across the cell, so moving across those cell membranes, requiring transporters, etc., and paracellular. And these go in both directions. So we can have transcellular reabsorption from the tubular fluid into peritubular capillaries, or we can have paracellular reabsorption going between the cells, moving from tubular fluid into peritubular capillaries. And the same for secretion, it can either be transcellular or it can be paracellular between the cells. Now, in different areas of the kidney, the structures will allow either transcellular and paracellular movement or simply transcellular movement. So if there's a lot of tight junctions, then it's not easy for movement to occur between the cells. So in some areas of the kidney, there is not paracellular movement. It's regulated, and therefore we only see transcellular movement of molecules. So let's have a look at sodium chloride and water reabsorption. These are the main functions within proximal convoluted tubule. So the majority of the filtered load of sodium chloride is reabsorbed in this area, but the tubular fluid remains isotonic. So how does this come about? Well, it's due to the movement of sodium ions, which are moved by secondary active transport. So here, on the basolateral membrane, we've got the sodium pump. So it's using energy, it's using ATP, that's what all those mitochondria are there for, and it's driving sodium into the peritubular capillaries to reduce intracellular calcium concentrations, to drive a favourable gradient for sodium to move into the cells, either by transcellular reabsorption or paracellular reabsorption of sodium chloride. As the sodium moves gradient generated drags chloride and water with it. So in many areas of the kidney, the movement of sodium drives the diffusion of chloride, and therefore the gradient to draw water out of the tubular fluid and into the peritubular capillaries and the surrounding interstitial fluid. So the solution stays isotonic because the gradients drive the movement to maintain osmolality. So the transport of sodium, again shown very simply here, is usually co-transported. So it can either be co-transported in the same direction as symport or via antiports. But the movement of sodium once it's inside the cell, again, this basolateral membrane movement is driven by secondary active transport mechanisms due to the active transport via the sodium pump. When we look at glucose reabsorption, in normal individuals, the filtered load of glucose and all the other vitamin metabolites such as amino acids are all reabsorbed within the proximal convoluted tubule. So in a normal individual that doesn't have too high a level of plasma glucose, all of that glucose should be reabsorbed within the proximal convoluted tubule. This is achieved by co-transport with sodium, and here we've got the kidney transporter SGLT2. And this transports 2 molecules of sodium for every molecule of glucose, and it's a co-transport both when moving into the cell across the apical membrane in the proximal convoluted tubule. Again, this is a co-transport that's driven as a secondary active transport mechanism. It's driven by the use of the sodium pump on the basolateral membrane, generating favourable sodium gradients to drive the co-transport and drive glucose uptake into the cells. So that drives more sodium into the peritubular capillaries, and once glucose is inside the cells, then it's transported by a second glucose transporter, GLUT2, on the basolateral membrane to allow uptake of that glucose from the proximal convoluted cells into peritubular capillaries. Now, the number of transporters that are present both on the apical and basolateral surfaces are enough to ensure that all those solutes, all that glucose is reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule under normal physiological conditions. The same goes for amino acids. It's almost an identical process. So in normal individuals, the filtered load of amino acids is reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. Again, it's a co-transport with sodium, requiring the activity of the sodium pump on the basolateral membrane to drive an amino acid transporter that moves 2 molecules of sodium for every amino acid that it pumps into the cell. With the amino acids leaving through other mechanisms on the basolateral surface to be taken back up into the peritubular capillaries. So, I've said that we shouldn't have any glucose present in urine under normal circumstances. Glucose is a small molecule. It's freely filtered within the nephronic structure. It's reabsorbed in the tubule, and as I said, it's reabsorbed mainly in the proximal convoluted tubule. It's not significantly metabolized, and therefore it doesn't affect glomerular filtration rate itself. So when you look at the clearance of glucose, the amount of glucose coming into the kidney structure should be the amount that leaves through the peritubular capillaries, because it's freely filtered and nothing is showing up in the urine, therefore it's all being reabsorbed, and as I said, reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. So when you carry out a clearance calculation for glucose, and that the plasma glucose concentration that we start with is not above the normal physiological levels, then we see that there is no excretion of glucose in urine. So it means when we carry out the clearance calculation, the urinary glucose calculation will be zero because the urinary glucose concentration is zero. And it doesn't matter how much volume we produce, anything times zero is going to give us a zero figure. So the clearance of glucose by definition in the normal individual is zero. Now this is a very useful physiological function of the kidney because we know that it's due to reabsorption of the substrates in the proximal convoluted tubule, because otherwise we would lose glucose in our urine and we would lose valuable energy, which would be lost in the urine production. So when we look at the clearance of glucose in normal glucose levels, then we identify other parameters that we want to talk about. So glucose reabsorption is carrier-mediated. We looked at it was a sodium glucose transporter process, and therefore the amount of those carriers could be saturated if the levels of glucose go above the normal physiological range. So therefore, there is a maximum transport rate for glucose within the kidney. So this is called the tubular transport maximum, or more commonly called the Tmax. So the kidney can normally reabsorb all the filtered glucose at normal plasma concentrations. So here is shown the normal glucose plasma concentration, and here the green line is the normal transport facility for glucose. So at this point in the normal range, the levels are well below the transport maximum that the kidney can perform. So none of the glucose shows up in the urine because you've got plenty of transporters, you're nowhere near the maximum, it's at a much higher level. So the normal range is about 4 to 6 nanomolar or 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter. So the normal handling of glucose is well below the maximum that the kidney can deal with under normal regulation. So what goes wrong if we have excess glucose concentrations? Well, this happens in both type 1 and type 2 diabetes mellitus, when excess glucose remains in the plasma because it's not been taken up and metabolized appropriately by cells due to changes in glucose transporters and excess glucose production in the form of gluconeogenesis as well. So other organs such as the liver, when the body thinks it's starving, will release glucose from liver stores back into the plasma to try and drive energy uptake of cells. Now that becomes very counterproductive because the plasma concentrations can be very high to begin with, and therefore they become sky high with conditions that release more and more glucose into the circulation to try and drive metabolism. So we see these concentrations can exceed the critical levels in conditions such as diabetes mellitus. And the transporters can become saturated if excess glucose is present in the plasma, and therefore you will go past the transport maximum for the kidney and glucose will start to show up in the urine. Now, in plasma levels above about 300 milligrams per deciliter, or about 16 millimolar, then we start to see urine, shown here in purple, showing up in the urine in individuals. So, once plasma glucose becomes very high, then we exceed the transport maximum and we start to see glucose showing up in the urine. But you go, hold on a minute, that purple line extends further than that cut-off that you've just talked about. And we do see glucose showing up in the urine down to around about 11 millimoles in the plasma. So we see a differential between what we know as the transport maximum and what physiologically we see glucose showing up in the urine. And this is a phenomenon called splay. And splay describes that although we have a transport maximum in each nephron, the overall output of the kidney is the sum of all those nephrons acting together. So we find across the kidney structure that some nephrons hit their transport maximum very early, and therefore glucose starts to show up in the urine at a slightly lower range of plasma glucose concentrations. So this is a physiological variation across all the nephrons in the kidney, and as I say, it's described as the phenomenon called splay. So it's not a sharp cut-off that suddenly you hit the transport maximum and it's a flat line. It is a curve where we start to see a number of nephrons hitting their transport maximum, and therefore glucose started to spill out into the urine. When we look at the reabsorption of bicarbonate by the proximal convoluted tubule, I've got two key mechanisms that I want to introduce to you. Again, they are due to secondary active transport, and they depend on the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. And this enzyme I introduced to you when we talked about lung structure as well, because it deals with conversion of CO2 to bicarbonate ions. Now, in terms of metabolic regulation, carbonic anhydrase is present inside the proximal convoluted tubule cells. And any CO2 that's present dissolved in plasma, remember cells can transport CO2 combined with hemoglobin, it's polyamino compounds, dissolved as a small amount of CO2, but the majority is transported as bicarbonate ions in solution around the red blood cells. Now remember, the ultrafiltrate was the same concentration of fluids as the blood, just minus the proteins and the red blood cells. So we've got a lot of bicarbonate ions and some CO2 that is present in that ultrafiltrate that we need to regulate. So within the proximal convoluted tubules, CO2, as it's a dissolved gas, can pass across plasma membranes. We can also handle CO2 that's present in the peritubular capillaries that can be secreted back into the proximal convoluted tubule cells. In reaction with carbonic anhydrase, CO2 and water combine to generate carbonic acid, and then dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And those bicarbonate ions can be taken back up into the peritubular capillaries. We're driving this process with energy using ATP with those mitochondria, and again sodium will be pumped on the basolateral membrane into the peritubular capillaries. Now that leaves us with a lot of hydrogen ions, and those hydrogen ions can be used to be exported from the cell using an antiport that moves sodium ions in and hydrogen ions out. Now this allows us to balance the pH and release hydrogen ions. So as I said, the kidney also plays a role in pH balance. So if we've got too much CO2 present and we want to reabsorb that CO2 either from the peritubular capillaries or from the ultrafiltrate, then we can swap CO2 for hydrogen ions. And you go, okay, that could make the urine very acidic, and at times it can, and that can cause urinary tract infections and inflammation if it's not balanced and handled appropriately. Now in the second mechanism I've got here, we can use those hydrogen ion concentrations that are being increased in tubular fluid to combine with bicarbonate ions that are present in the tubular fluid. And remember, that's the main way, the main buffering system, the way CO2 is transported within the blood plasma is as bicarbonate ions. Remember, 80 to 90% of those, that CO2 is transported in that format. So the bicarbonate can combine with hydrogen, and again, we have carbonic anhydrase expressed on the microvilli surface on the apical side of the membrane. So that's the membrane side that's facing into the tubule. And in the presence of carbonic anhydrase, again, we drive the process in the other direction. We can drive this to generate carbonic acids, water, and CO2. So we can neutralise the hydrogen ions that are produced by combining them with bicarbonate that allows, therefore, just water to be released, and that CO2 can be taken up, and again, this process here can reabsorb that as bicarbonate to balance any changes in bicarbonate levels, CO2 levels within both tubular fluid, to reabsorb valuable buffers such as bicarbonate, and to also balance our CO2 concentrations, which can become very elevated in certain respiratory conditions and other metabolic imbalances. So the reabsorption of bicarbonate in the proximal convoluted tubule plays this role in pH balance through several mechanisms. It allows us to actively secrete hydrogen ions. It allows those hydrogen ions to be used to grab further buffers such as bicarbonate. But bicarbonate isn't the only ion that we can balance with the hydrogen ions. We can also buffer those hydrogen ions with phosphate and ammonia. And these can come from breakdown products, again from metabolism, again from breakdown of nutrient sources, and breakdown of amino acids in the form of protein breakdown as well. So when we look at the way that we can balance and neutralise those hydrogen ions, we can do this also through attaching the hydrogen ions to phosphate, which can be removed straight away into urine. This can be balanced, as I said, from driving more CO2 reabsorption to increase hydrogen ion production where required if CO2 gas is in excess and you want to remove it from the peritubular capillaries. And the same mechanism, you can balance this with ammonia, and again you would see phosphate and ammonia showing up in the urine. You would generally want to reabsorb the bicarbonate because it's one of the most useful buffers that we have to balance our pH across the body. Now this means your urine pH can vary enormously from 4.5 up to 8, and that balance will change across the day and from day to day depending on your other metabolic status. So as I said, the kidney is where we integrate both metabolism and respiration to balance the pH across the body. But the net outcome is that the majority of bicarbonate is reabsorbed within the proximal convoluted tubule. So remember, as in the lung, we need the enzyme carbonic anhydrase present to drive the CO2 exchange mechanism to allow us to reabsorb that bicarbonate. When we've looked at glomerular filtration rate on Monday, I've always highlighted that the glomerular filtration rate is just a portion of the blood flow going into the glomerulus at any one time. So we can also estimate this, as we did with inulin or creatinine for glomerular filtration rate. We can estimate what the renal blood flow is using a component called para-aminopiccuric acid, so shortened to PAH in many textbooks. This is a factor that's also freely filtered, but this time this factor is secreted by the tubule from the blood to the lumen. It's not metabolized and it doesn't affect glomerular filtration rate. So when you look at the peritubular capillaries down here, there should be no PAH, there's no para-aminopiccuric acid. So anything that passes through the glomerulus ends up going back into the tubular fluid and being released as urine. Okay? So, when we try to work out what the renal perfusion flow rate is, then if the plasma concentration of PAH is within the normal physiological level, then the PAH in the efferent arteriole is handled and fully secreted by the peritubular capillaries back into the nephron structure, back into tubular fluid. Which means when we calculate clearance, the afferent arterial or the plasma concentration of PAH multiplied by the renal perfusion pressure should give us the clearance of PAH. And because this element is 0, because the concentration here in the peritubular capillaries is 0 times the renal perfusion rate, means that this element is 0, meaning that the handling of pH times the perfusion rate is the same as the urinary concentration times the volume of urine that's being produced. So basically we look at the clearance of PAH, which will give us, which can be calculated from the urinary concentration times the volume of urine divided by the plasma concentration of PAH. That gives us, so the clearance of PAH gives us the renal perfusion rate. So when you calculate the clearance of PAH, it gives us a value of 625 mils per minute. And if you think back to the gold standards inulin, if you work out its clearance, it's around about 125 mils per minute. So I always said to you, only a proportion of the blood goes down through the glomerulus and goes into tubular fluid. And when you calculate the difference, you see that this is 5 times higher than the clearance of inulin, which tells you that every time the blood passes through the glomerulus, a fifth of the plasma gets tipped down in through the glomerulus and becomes tubular fluid. So every time the blood flows through a glomerulus, a fifth of that fluid goes down into the filtration system and becomes ultrafiltrate within the tubule. So overall, within the proximal convoluted tubule, we see that the majority of sodium is reabsorbed, and the textbooks vary, but I've gone with the Torah version because it gives a much nicer diagram. So they reckon about 65% of the sodium is reabsorbed within the proximal convoluted tubule. About the same amount of potassium, all of the glucose, all of the amino acids, and the chloride follows by diffusion. So to move the sodium, we've got sodium pumps, and we've got various syn-ports and anti-ports. Remember, we looked at glucose transport, co-transport, amino acid co-transport. All of those are dragging sodium out of the tubular fluid. Whereas the chloride that's going to balance that sodium is following by diffusion. So the sodium gradient that's generated to the peritubular capillaries drags that chloride along. And remember, I pointed out in the diagram, it often is dragged through paracellular mechanisms, so between the cells in the proximal convoluted tubule. We see that the majority of bicarbonate, anywhere between 80 to 90% of bicarbonate is reabsorbed, again through various mechanisms, through combining with hydrogen ions, through therefore CO2 uptake, etc. Now the water that moves balances the sodium and the chloride and the potassium that's moved, and the water moves by osmosis. You've set up ionic gradients that are going to be favourable for water to move. And in the proximal convoluted tubule, you don't need specific regulated water channels. The membranes are permeable and water can move and follow the different ions and solutes that are moving. When we look at other mechanisms, so urea also follows by diffusion, and mostly this will follow the water and other ion movements that we see across the kidney in this area. Small amounts of calcium and magnesium also move, but again, like the chloride, they tend to move by diffusion. Where we see active secretion, and the mechanisms that I highlighted to you, then we see hydrogen ions being actively secreted so that we can reabsorb that bicarbonate. Due to anti-port mechanisms, remember it was being swapped for sodium. Ammonia, again phosphate as well. Again, this will depend on the level of acidosis, alkalosis, so it will depend on the pH balance that is required. And a small amount of urea can also be secreted. We said previously creatinine was a usable measure of glomerular filtration rate, but a small amount is secreted within the tubular, proximal convoluted tubule. So we've started with a concentrated, or a fluid that's the same concentration as plasma. We've removed the protein, large proteins, we've removed the red blood cells, we've got ultrafiltrate, and by now we've reabsorbed quite a proportion of sodium, potassium, chloride, water. So when people talk about how the kidney reabsorbs water and handles water balance, everybody goes, oh, the end portion of the kidney reabsorbs most of the water. That's rubbish. It has a regulated mechanism for water reabsorption. The majority of water is reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubules. Now, when the fluid gets to the end of the proximal convoluted tubules, the concentrations have changed, but the process has not changed the tone. It's still isotonic fluid. It's still sitting there as it was in blood plasma, around about 290, 300 millimosmoles per litre. So far within the kidney, we've reabsorbed a lot of the valuable nutrients, so we shouldn't have any glucose or amino acids left under normal physiological conditions, and we've reabsorbed a large proportion of the valuable ions and solutes within or from the tubular fluid. In the next lecture, I'll go on to talk about the loop of Henle, where you will want to concentrate tubular fluid. Up till now, we've changed the amount of water, we've changed and reabsorbed some of the valuable nutrients, but we've still got quite a large volume. So you're still looking at, 35% of the water. Even losing 35% of our water load on a cycle through the nephron, we would dehydrate very, very quickly. So we need to think about how that water is also going to be reabsorbed within the remaining sections of the kidney. So I've gone over reabsorption and secretion, and you should know which way that goes. So if I ask a question and define paracellular reabsorption, you should be able to do so. You now know about the different transport of ions such as glucose and amino acids, and you know they use secondary active transport mechanisms, and they use co-transporters to move them across the apical membrane, and they have different either facilitated or diffusion mechanisms at the lateral membranes. The handling of glucose and amino acids mean that there should be no glucose in particular in the urine that's produced, and if there is, then it means the kidney's gone past its transport maximum, which is an ideal value and can sometimes be lower than that ideal transport maximum because of splay, because all the nephrons are not in sync at any one time, so we do see a little bit of physiological variation, which is described as splay in the transport maximum capacity within the tubule. We can reabsorb bicarbonate in a number of processes relying on carbonic anhydrase as a key enzyme, and therefore we can reabsorb that as a valuable buffer to regulate the pH of the circulatory plasma, and therefore lose excess hydrogen ions into urine where required. So we've got a lot of different secretory processes going on also in the tubular proximal convoluted tubule, and we can estimate renal plasma flow rate using the substance para-aminohippuric acid. Okay, so I'm going to stop there today. Tomorrow we'll be in here between 1 and 2, and that's the catch-up lecture that unfortunately I was too ill to give. So it's the last endocrinology lecture in that series, just so that you have it before the vacation, before the end of term. Okay, in here, 1 to 2 tomorrow. Okay, thank you very much. And I've released your practical marks for the long practical, and again, test 2 released as well. So on the whole, they were very well performed, nice high marks there again, and very well done. So there's very few of you that missed any of those tests. Be aware that if you miss any of them, they're all quite low stakes, so it's not the end of the world. But just make sure that you don't miss too many of them because you're throwing marks away. Okay? So have a look at the marks. I released them earlier on in the week so you know where you stand. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.